Today's date is April 21, 1995. Survivor Stephen Orlowski. The interviewer, Mark Goldberg. We're in Port Washington on Long Island in New York, in the United States of America. The language is English, and if you hear a little noise, that's rain beating against the skylight. My name is Mark Goldberg, Goldberg. Today's date is April 21, 1995. I'm conducting the interview with Mr. Stephen Orlowski. We're in Port Washington, New York, in the United States of America. Hey, please tell me your name and spell your name, please.
My name is Stephen Orlowski, S-T-E-V-E-N, Orlowski, O-R-L-O-W-S-K-I.
Could you tell me your name at birth and spell
Yes.
that?
My given name was two very proper Polish names, Kazimierz Stefan Orlowski, and actually in Polish Orlowski is Orłowski. Kazimierz is K-A-Z-I-M-I-E-R-Z, and Stefan is simple, S-T-E-F-A-N.
Hey, did you have any other names or nicknames?
Yes. When well, maybe we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but when I came to Israel, I was given the name Yigאl.
No, I mean when you were a child.
When I was a child, yes. As any child, I was called shorter than Kazimierz, which is Kazio. And
How do you
everybody in
spell
my
that?
family knows me as Kazio, K-A-Z-I-O.
What is your date of birth?
April 28, 1933.
And what is your age today?
Almost 62.
Okay, so you're 61
And
still.
And 9/10.
Okay. Could you tell us where you were born, what city and what country?
Yes, I was born in Warsaw in Poland.
Okay. Please tell me about any memories you have from before the war, or any memories you have of things that your parents or others told you about Warsaw before the war.
Well, obviously the memories from before the war are mostly what I was told or what I've seen from pictures, and obviously some of it I remember, but not much. Let me maybe start with telling you a little bit about my family background.
Good.
My grandfather on my father's side was a respected merchant in Warsaw. He was well known in the Jewish community, not only that he was a religious man, but he was also a very strong supporter of Zionism. Actually, he was among the group of people that went to Palestine, I guess it must have been early 20s or maybe even before that, to lay the cornerstone for the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus. And actually, if you go to the university there, you'll find a picture of all those people, and he's right there. Now, my grandfather, during the First World War, excuse me, felt that probably Poland will be a battleground, as it has been for many wars before that. And he took his family out of Warsaw to Odessa, to Russia, which obviously he didn't figure out on the revolution then that will happen in Russia. He took his family and 4 of his children. My father was the 5th, the oldest. Since my father was admitted to the medical school of the Warsaw University, which was exceptionally difficult for a Jew, not only that you had to be very capable, but also you had to be very lucky, and probably more than that. My father stayed on in Warsaw. My father graduated, maybe I should mention here, my father's name was Maximilian Orlowski. His Polish name was Mieczysław Orlowski, and my mother called him Mietek. This was sort of the same as Kazio. My father graduated from the medical school in Warsaw, and then he went on to Paris, to Sorbonne, to specialize in gynecology. He couldn't take the long sleepless nights, and then he decided to go back to Sorbonne and study ear, nose, and throat. And even at that, he wasn't happy. I don't know why. And at that time, radiology was the new and exciting branch of medicine, and he started specializing in radiology. And this is the time that he met my mother. On my mother's side, my grandfather, Nathan Rosenzweig. I don't think I mentioned my grandfather on my father's side. His name was Israel Orlovsky. My grandfather on my mother's side, Nathan or Nusin, I guess, Rosenzweig, actually came from fairly poor background. The family was from Częstochowa. He married into a very rich rabbinical family. The family actually didn't want him. They were not too keen on his marrying their daughter. He assured them that he will not want anything from them. And I guess just to prove a point, within fairly short time, he became by far wealthier than his in-laws. He owned lumber yards, he owned mills, he leased forests, and he had a lot of real estate. About 5 years ago, we went to Częstochowa, and I saw my grandfather's house, which really I didn't remember as a child. It's sort of a large two-story house on the main avenue of Częstochowa, leading to the famous medieval church. The front of the house is very impressive with a big gate where horse-drawn carriages would go in, and behind the house there was a circle, there were stables, and also behind my grandfather's house were two other houses where two of my uncles with their families lived and worked for him. My grandfather believed that his kids, if they were able, whether daughters or sons, they should obtain higher education. My mother graduated from Sorbonne in Paris as a chemical engineer. And since the mother died at an early age, my mother, so to speak, adopted her younger sister, Eva. Eva studied medicine, and the same as my father, finished as a radiologist. Now you can imagine two young women in Paris in the swinging 20s. They had a terrific time. Eva, who was an exceptionally good-looking woman, was in charge of the social activities. My mother was in charge of studying and housekeeping. Many students would sort of follow Eva, and she would bring them to their apartment, and in due course their apartment has become a social gathering place for students. My mother had a very spatial beauty, not as maybe obvious or as Hollywoody as Eva. And most of the students, after they came to the apartment, they would fall in love with my mother and sort of not abandon, but pay less attention to Eva. My mother has become one of the, I guess, the arbitrator of the long discussions that, as you can imagine, students would have those days in this kind of environment. My father was one of the men who met Eva. He initially, I think, was quite keen on marrying her, but then he met my mother, and they were married after a short time. I guess they must have been, I'm not sure whether they were married in Paris or Warsaw, but shortly after they were married, my mother became pregnant with my brother. I think my father probably was somewhat leery of her popularity with the other men or the other students with whom she was very friendly. When my mother became pregnant with my brother, they decided to go back to Warsaw. Sort of. On their return to Warsaw, my father opened a clinic, radiology clinic, with the help of my grandfather from Częstochowa, because as you can imagine, X-ray equipment those days was terribly expensive. And my brother was born in 1929, February of 1929. His given name was Jerzy Henryk Orlowski. Again, very proper Polish names. Actually, if you translate it to English, it's George Henry Orlowski. My brother wasn't well when he was born. He was kind of sickly kid. And the doctors recommended to my parents that they move to a small village, or move out of the city, I should say. My parents then moved about 10 kilometers out of Warsaw to a place called Radość, which means happiness in Polish. I was born in 1933, and as we said before, we mentioned my names before. And the first few years of my life, I lived in Radość with my parents. I don't remember too much from Radość. We rented a house. I remember playing with the neighbors' kids at the house, which was they were mostly Polish kids. We did all the things that kids do at that age. Probably I mostly followed my brother because he was 4 years older than I. I was bitten by I remember being bitten by a mad dog, and my father, waking me up every morning before he went to work, and he would give me an injection to my stomach for 21 days. And then our house was actually surrounded by a fence, but there was no gate. That's how the dog got in. My mother put in the fence a green gate. Now, when I was 5 years ago in Poland and we went to see that house, the green gate is still there. I guess things really haven't changed very much in Poland over the 50 years. After Radość, when my brother was ready to start going to school and I was ready for kindergarten, we moved back to Warsaw. At that time, the PPS, the Polska Partia Socjalistyczna, which means the Polish Socialist Party, has built blocks of apartments in a new neighborhood called Żoliborz. This was a new concept. Actually, those were condos. Primarily, those blocks of apartments were oriented for blue-collar families, but in the building where we moved to, there was a wing for professional people with 3-4 bedrooms, and I remember in our apartment there was even a room for the maid. The address of our apartment was Krasińska 16 Krasińska. I think this is the address I gave you. And the primary point of my parents moving to those blocks of apartments is that the schools there were co-ed, which was very unusual for Poland of those days, Poland being a mostly Catholic country. In addition to this, there was very little discrimination in the schools against Jewish children. So the primary motive for our parents to buy into those condos were the schools. The schools were only open for children that came from those apartments. Thinking of Radość, my own memories, again I remember playing with the kids, the normal games. We had the apartment buildings were divided into blocks. We had big walls between the blocks, and we would take prisoners, this kind of stuff. Obviously, I was too little to participate too much in it. I remember hitching rides on horse-drawn carriages, which was main transportation means in Warsaw still those days, and doing what most kids do at that age. I remember from home, as far as a religion, my parents were totally assimilated. They believed that they were Poles of Hebrew religion, and I would say probably they were atheists. They didn't believe in much of anything. I don't remember celebrating any holidays at home, Jewish or Christian. Christmas time, I remember we might have had not always, a small Christmas tree, which was more of a decorations than any kind of religious significance. Actually, when my brother was born and when I was born, our parents didn't intend to circumcise us, and if not for our grandparents who came and joined forces every time, this would not have happened. In hindsight, looking at the chances of children with or without circumcision as far as surviving during the war, probably our chances of surviving would have been greater, but be it as it may.
Let me go back to to when you were about 5 years old and you moved to Warsaw. What awareness did you have at home and in school that you were Jewish?
None at all. We as children did not know that we were Jewish until the war started. Our parents, I guess, considered themselves to be the new professional European intelligentsia, and they did not feel that religion played any important part. My grandparents were religious people.
Okay, so what awareness did other people have that you were Jewish? Did you feel any anti-Semitism, or did you feel any pressure that you recall from your grandparents to behave Jewishly or to be aware that they were Jewish?
None at all. I guess our parents made a good job in guarding us against any of it, and I have never run into any anti-Semitism. Actually, to the contrary, apparently, I was one of those kids that used to bully other kids, and my mother used to get complaints that I would beat other kids, which were Polish kids, so I don't think there was any... I think also the fact that we were in this neighborhood, which was the working person area, and the Polish Socialist Party, I guess probably one of the planks in the platform was no anti-Semitism. To what extent it worked, I don't know, but as a child, I didn't feel any anti-Semitism.
Well, tell me whatever memories you have then of your school, and tell me a little bit about your mother and father. What do you remember of them?
Okay, my mother and father from that period, my father would, since we moved to, well, since we were in Radość and then we were in Żoliborz, my father ended up buying a car and he became a regular commuter, commuting to his clinic on Graniczna Street number 6. My mother, as a rule, would go with him to work. She would help him. We had a Polish nanny, Celina, who took care of us, and we would give her a lot of hard time. I remember as a child, the important events in the family life were Sunday lunches. We had always many friends, many family members around the dining room table. We had a huge dining room and a very large table. As a child, I remember whenever we decided to run from home, we would go to a church which wasn't too far from our house. And there were always old ladies, Polish ladies, sitting on the steps of the church, and they would tell us all sorts of stories. So this was a favorite pastime, and if mother knew that we ran away from the house and she wanted to find us, she would go there. We would go on vacation in the winters with our parents. Winter was always going to Zakopane, which was the Polish Tartatian mountains. As a toddler, I could ski quite well. My brother was an excellent skier, and so was my father. And in the summer, we would go on vacations with mother to the mountains or to the seashore. And actually, when the war broke out in 1939, we were vacationing with mother in Szczyrk, which was a little resort place on the Czech not too far from the Czech border, which then was the German border. Trying to think about anything else. Yeah, I mentioned my grandfathers and my parents. I should mention a very important person in our lives, which was Aunt Stefa. Stefa was our favorite aunt because she would bring us the best toys always. She was my father's sister. She grew up in Odessa, and she had a lot of the Russian basic characteristics in her. She was very straightforward, very honest, very practical, down to earth, both feet on the ground. She never finished high school. She told her father that she wanted to become independent, and her father said, if that's what you want, that's what you'll do. And he said, if this is your decision, we must shake hands on this. And she always used to tell us how she shook hands with her father, and apparently there is some Hebrew blessing when you shake hands. Much of the diamond industry business is done with that blessing. I'm not too sure what it is. And they shook hands, and he explained to her, once you did that, you must do what you committed yourself to do. And she indeed opened a fashion store on one of the most fashionable avenues of Warsaw. And she did exceedingly well. And she became totally financially and otherwise independent. She was a very good and close friend to my parents. Anything else from before the war?
Well, what contact did you have with your grandparents?
We had no contact, or very little contact, with my grandfather from Częstochow. He was, our grandmother died when she was quite young, and Częstochow being a distance from Warsaw, I remember maybe visiting him once or twice. We really didn't know him. Our grandparents in Warsaw would come Friday nights and would try to make it somewhat of a Jewish Friday evening, but they didn't have too much success with that. Incidentally, my grandfather wanted my father to study veterinary medicine in the American University in Beirut and then settle in Palestine, but this obviously never happened. Other than this, from before the war, sort of the normal children type of games, memories, and we had very good lives. We had a loving family. Our mother was an exceptionally warm and loving person. We had good family life. I remember my father getting up for work every morning, and he had always 2 soft eggs waiting for him in a glass prepared by the cook, and the white collar and the new shirt going to work. So there are sort of pictures that I remember as a child of certain things that would happen in the house, but we had a very good childhood, very in a loving atmosphere and with total care or anything that a child could desire.
What do you remember that year or two that you were in school? Do you remember any of what the classrooms looked like? Do you remember any of your teachers?
Well, my school was really not a school, but a kindergarten. I forget the name. I think I gave it to you. It was R something or other. It was part of this complex.
RTPD.
RTPD, which would be Dete in Polish. The woman who ran this kindergarten, her name was Donia. She was a Jewish lady, which I didn't know. It was a very, very modern building, very bright. I remember lunchtime, we would have to rest lying on the floor for, I don't know, half an hour and an hour. And whoever was the quietest while resting would get up first and choose the best toy. I was always last to get up, and then I would go to the kid who got up first and took away his toy. And some of those complaints came to my mother in due course. My brother, who, because I guess of his early health problems, was fairly short in stature, wasn't very strong, and the kids at school would beat him up on and off until he eventually found a big Polish kid with whom he would share his lunch as a protection payment, and from there on his life became sort of reasonably good. My brother didn't like his school. I loved my kindergarten, but this was probably one of the better schools in Warsaw where Jewish children could grow up in a mixed, not just Jewish environment. Trying to think about anything else before the war. Well, we mentioned the vacations.
Well, let's go to the vacation that you were on with your mother when the war began. Where were you? When did you first learn that there was a war?
Well, the talk of the war, I was too young to understand it, but the talk of the war was there for quite a while, with Hitler entering Czechoslovakia and all the pre-war history. My father even went to the extent of applying for a visa to Australia. And my family received papers allowing them to emigrate to Australia. When I say my family, it's the four of us. But the Australian government did not allow him to bring his X-ray equipment, which those days was extremely expensive. And I don't think that my parents took the war too seriously, as many Jews and Poles. So even when should we get into start of the war, which would be the next...
Yeah, tell me what you remember about the very beginning of the war. You remember being on vacation, you said.
I remember before going on vacation, our parents talking about a war, but it obviously was, as far as I was concerned, water of a duck's back. We went to Szczyrk, which was not too far from the German border, and then one day the war was there. We caught probably the last taxi out of the resort area. Actually, judging on the first day of war, we kids liked the war. Looked like a lot of fun. We must have taken the last taxi out of the resort area to the train station, because behind our taxi there was a military police car with the sirens going, because all private cars were to be mobilized by the army. We got to the railroad station and the train was totally mobbed. This must have been like the last train going to Warsaw from that area. Bear in mind that this was not too far from the German border or the Czech border. There was no way of getting on the train, but there were a few men standing in one of the cars in the window, and Mother smiled at them, and 2 seconds later the three of us were hoisted through the window onto the train, and we just couldn't believe our eyes that Mother would allow something like this to happen to her, because we were very polite kids. And then when we came to Warsaw to top the day, Father was wearing his officer's military uniform with all the fancy insignia, and to us, I mean, we loved seeing him in his military uniform. Obviously for Mother it wasn't that happy. They sat for a while, they were talking to each other, and my father assured my mother that he'll be back in about 2 weeks' time, because there was no way that Germany could win the war against England and France that were entering the war at that point. And
okay, we'll stop there and we'll continue on the next tape.
very good.
This is tape number 2. Today is April 21, 1995. I am Mark Goldberg, the interviewer, and interviewing Stephen Orlowski. Excuse me, interviewing Stephen Orlowski. We're in Port Washington on Long Island in New York, in the United States. Okay. Okay, please continue. You and your mother and your brother just arrived in Warsaw. Your father is in uniform, and the war has started. What did you see? What did you feel? What did you hear?
Well, my father being a medical doctor, he was obviously immediately mobilized. We were sort of happy to see him wearing his uniform, and we were very proud of him, and obviously the true meaning of what was happening escaped at least myself. But he sat with his mother for a while and he spoke with her, and he assured her that the war will be over in 2 weeks and he'll be home in 2 weeks and there's nothing to worry. That the British and the French will definitely defeat the Germans, and with the Polish help, especially I guess the Polish horse riders. And they hugged for a long time and they said goodbye, but little did they know that actually this would be the last time they would see each other. Father was sent to the Eastern Front, where he was taken a prisoner of war by the Russians. As you may recall, the Russians entered Poland from the east, whereas Germany entered Poland from the west. There was a pact between Hitler and Stalin. One of the men that was with father in the camp came to Warsaw and told us that father was very helpful to the prisoners, being a doctor, and eventually he was selected, so to speak, an arbitrator of any argument, any problems in the camp, to settle those problems. He was well respected there. He escaped the prisoners of war camp. He tried to cross back into the German-held Poland. He was caught by the Russians crossing the border and sent to Siberia. From there on, we lost track of him. Mother would always say, "You'll be surprised that he'll just walk in one day and he'll be back with us." But this obviously didn't happen. Probably to some degree he was lucky that he escaped and was sent to Siberia, because not too long after that, many of the Polish officers were gathered by the Soviets and slaughtered in a place called Katyn. The Germans overran Poland very quickly, as it's well known, using the Blitzkrieg. Warsaw foolishly stood against the Germans probably for close to a month. Mother figured that our houses in Żoliborz, she used to call them the houses of cards, wouldn't be very good in a war, and we moved to my father's clinic at Graniczna 6, which was an old building, old solid building in the middle of the city. We spent most of that month in the cellar of the building because the city was continually shelled and bombed. I guess Warsaw must have been the first city to feel the full brunt of the German warfare against civilians. A few days before Warsaw capitulated, Mother woke us up in the middle of the night. We used to sleep in the cellar fully closed. And she told us that the building is burning and we must immediately leave the building. I can almost see this picture like you see a picture in a movie. My mother walking in the middle of this canyon of fire, because the building on both sides of Graniczna Street were burning, holding us by our hands. As it happened, our grandfather was with us, and he insisted on loading a suitcase with our stuff, and he kept on dragging this heavy suitcase, and Mother kept on saying to him, "Please just drop it, leave it in the street," but he wouldn't. And with his free hand, he would extinguish fire sparks that fell on our coats. So you can see this woman walking with two children and in the middle of this canyon of fire. After a couple of days, we got back to our apartment in Żoliborz, which obviously remained untouched. And a few days later, the German army entered Warsaw, and as it happens, I don't know if this was the only route, but one of the routes was not too far from our house. I remember standing there with my brother and the rest of much of the population along the German entry route into Warsaw. The people were totally silent, with total amazement or disbelief in their eyes. And the only sound that you would hear was the sound of the German drums, and the other sound was the sound of the German boot against the Warsaw cobblestone. I think the sound sort of kept on repeating itself, the sound of the German boot, whenever something terrible was going to happen later on, so it does remain in one's memory. As the Germans entered the city, a German soldier was shot. I don't know how, but the Germans selected 50 Jews to be executed in lieu of this one soldier. Among them was my grandfather. They were shot that day and the bodies were dumped in the Vistula River. I guess there is some irony to it, maybe, because my grandfather was among the first 50 Jews to be murdered by the Nazis in Warsaw. I, his grandson, survived, and you sort of ask yourself many times the question, why did I survive and not somebody else? But that's how it happened.
As a small boy, when this happened, you were completely aware, you knew your grandfather had been selected,
my
you knew
grandfather.
he had been shot?
I didn't know as it happened, but I knew a few days later.
Okay.
Incidentally, his body could not have been retrieved because the river, it was October probably by then, and the river formed a heavy layer of ice, and only in the spring that my Aunt Stefa could retrieve her father's body. And she said when she was right there below the ice, and she said he just looked like he was asleep. I guess the bodies remained preserved throughout the winter. Shortly, the Germans, I guess, entered Warsaw late September, early October. In December of 1939, the Warsaw ghetto was formed. My statistics are not too good, but I believe that the Jewish population in Warsaw was about close to 300,000, or 1/3 of the city, whereas the Warsaw ghetto area was about 10% of the city. So obviously the overcrowding, homelessness, and the resulting poverty were terrible. Mother was very lucky, or we were very lucky, in that Mother found a family at Żelazna Street number 62 that were willing to swap their 4th floor walk-up apartment for our apartment in Żoliborz. So at least we had an apartment. I should also mention that just before moving into the ghetto, Mother and Stefa went to our bank and emptied the safe deposit box, which was full of gold coins. Actually, they put it in a suitcase, and the suitcase was that heavy that neither one of them alone could carry the suitcase. I'm mentioning it because this was a very important factor in our surviving during the war, this money. Also, Mother did another very wise thing. She took our large dining room table into the ghetto. She had a carpenter make it into a box by nailing planks of wood on 4 sides to the legs. The top would slide open, and she had it filled in with coal. And basically this kept us warm through the difficult winters in the ghetto, especially the winter of 1940-41 was known to be one of the more difficult winters. Many people perished then. Our life in the ghetto sort of fell into fairly normal routine. My brother had private lessons with 2 other boys. Actually, one of the boys was the son of Donia, my teacher from the kindergarten. I went to a private school, and I remember walking in the street every morning to the school. I would normally keep my books and my lunch sandwich under my coat. And as I walked on the street, on the side of the road, or in the gutter, you could see dead bodies lined up to be picked up, just covered with newspapers. So this is the type of normal survival of a child in a ghetto, not even having to survive, but just seeing what was happening. On the other side of the sidewalk, along the wall, you had those people that were still dying. Some of them were already partially unclothed because some other people needed their clothes. Actually, I remember a man walking to me and ripping my coat apart, grabbing, the books fell on the sidewalk. He grabbed my sandwich, and before any of the passers-by had a chance to do anything, he had the sandwich in his mouth, and I just stood there in amazement to see the paper and the string disappear in his mouth. He then bent up, picked up my books, apologized, he simply said he was hungry, and he handed me back the books and walked away. So this was sort of the normal routine of living in the ghetto, even for somebody like myself who was able to go to private school, and we didn't starve or didn't die from the cold weather. Obviously there are I guess I'm sure you have enough historic evidence on the ghetto that we don't need to get into that. But I would say this type of existence in the ghetto went probably from through 1940 to sometimes in 1941, during which period my mother contracted typhoid and she barely lived through it. Steffa spent with us day and night sitting by her bed, and one of my mother's brothers came from Częstochowa and he spent time with us. His name was Edward. He was an engineer. He was a member of the Communist Party, and he had ways of moving around. I guess sometimes in 1941 the deportation started out of the ghetto. Obviously until that point the Germans kept on bringing more and more people in the ghetto. So the overcrowding, the homelessness, the poverty kept on only increasing. When the deportation started in the Warsaw Ghetto, they also started in other cities around Poland, including Częstochowa. A woman who worked for my grandfather, a Polish woman, came to the ghetto to talk to mother and tell her what happened with the family in Częstochowa. My grandfather's house was surrounded by Germans and police, and they were all told, my two uncles with the families were told to come down to the street, including my grandfather. My grandfather remained sitting in his study, and a German officer came up. When the German officer came up, he noticed many works of art and paintings, and he asked my grandfather to explain to him what those were. My grandfather, who spoke fluent German, very precisely told him what every item was, and then he sat behind his desk and he said to him, "Well, I would like you now to do me a favor." The German officer said, "What would that be?" And my grandfather said, "If I'm going to die, I'm going to die right here behind my desk. Could you please shoot me?" The German officer took out his handgun and shot my grandfather. My two uncles with their families were obviously taken to one of the death camps because we never heard from them again. As the deportation started in the Warsaw Ghetto and the population started thinning out, at the same time, we were in what's called the small ghetto. At the same time, a German, there could have been some other factories, but at the same time a German by the name of Karl George Schulz opened a textile factory not too far from Leszno. One of the managers in his factory, he was a Jewish man from Lodz who was a textile expert and who lost his wife and one of his daughters earlier to one of the deportations. He was a manager in that factory, as I mentioned, and he met Steffa. They got to like each other, and after a while she became his girlfriend. Through him, Steffa and my mother got jobs in the factory and papers that supposedly exempted them from being deported. Not that it did, but it was something. I just remember the first being caught in the first raid of deportation. We were actually in the factory building. My mother and Stefan started already working. They were working in the spooling department. You could always hear, well, the building, the deportations took different forms. It could be just simply few blocks, just people in the street were suddenly surrounded and sent to the Umschlagplatz. All the deportation from Warsaw took place from Umschlagplatz. I'm not going over some of the things that I'm sure are well known as to how the deportation took place in Warsaw from the Umschlagplatz and so forth. Or
You tell any of the story you want to tell.
Okay. Well, the Umschlagplatz, initially the deportations affected poor people, homeless people, orphanages. The deportations took place from Umschlagplatz, which was an open space and a railroad siding. Once you got into the Umschlagplatz, there was probably no way that you could be saved, because there were hundreds of people there. Once you were commingled with those people and loaded on the trains, especially for children like us, my brother and I, we would have never survived. So just getting to the Umschlagplatz basically meant death. I should also mention that initially people in the Warsaw Ghetto didn't know that being deported was going to death camps. Initially it was thought that those people were going to labor camps. But it didn't take very long for people to realize what it was. Also at some point, and I don't remember the dates, Cherniak, the head of, so to speak, of the ghetto, committed suicide when he was told to produce a certain number of people every day to be sent to the Umschlagplatz. So people knew that those were not labor camps. In spite of that, the Germans offered every person coming to the Umschlagplatz a loaf of bread and some jam. And many people, out of sheer starvation, knowing, even though knowing that they might be going to the death, went to the Umschlagplatz on their own volition because they wanted this loaf of bread. I guess probably for most people like yourselves, hearing a steam locomotive, the whistle of a steam locomotive, is a nostalgic thing. For me, it reminds me at night in the ghetto, lying in bed and hearing the whistles of steam locomotives. And every time I heard it, I knew that another train was leaving, loaded with people going somewhere, from where those people will never return. So really I have no any nostalgia attached to it. If anything, some kind of a fear.
At this time, you're about 9 years old. 1942.
1942, about 9 years old, yes.
What can you remember knowing? What did you know? Did you understand what it meant to be taken to the Umschlagplatz? Did you understand that people were being deported, or is this something that you came to know later?
No. I fully understood that being sent to the Umschlagplatz was basically going to your death. As a child of 9, you know what it means to die. You also know what it means for your family to be killed, for your mother or people that you depended on. I also knew the fear of raids, of Germans, of police looking for you, because as a rule we would hide. And I knew that if we were found, we would be simply shot. Children that, including myself, that even though I was probably more shielded than some other children, still I knew exactly what was happening. I knew the terrible fear of losing people that I loved and depended on, and death to myself, my brother. I don't think there was a way of escaping it, and you became much more mature and older in this type of atmosphere. I remember the first time that the factory was raided, even though it's supposed to be exempt. I remember that mother, the two of us, and Uncle Eric was still with us. We escaped to the attic of the factory. And the Germans and the police were not too far behind us, so there was a young man there who threw a narrow plank. The attic was on the 7th floor, threw a narrow plank from our building to the building across the alley. And most people crossed that plank. I just froze on this plank in the middle. I was so scared. So Uncle Eric came back, picked me up. We walked to the other side of the plank. When this group of 20 people were in the attic of the next door building, I remember a woman looking through the window, and she saw her daughter being taken. And she went into shock. She tried to scream, but she couldn't scream. So as you can see, as a 9-year-old child, I remember those things because they had such a strong impact. The only thing that this woman could do is pounce with her feet on the floor. But even at that, the Germans and the police came up through the other building. They took us down. Uncle Eric simply took us by our hands and mother, and we walked into a staircase of another building. A Jewish policeman ran after us, and he told us to follow him. Uncle Eric said to him, "If you take care of this woman and those children, you will kill them." He just looked at us and he walked away. After that, Mother and Steffa kept on working in the spooling department. My brother would help. He was old enough for that. I was too little to be seen in the factory. And I would simply hide under the machine. I remember another raid on the factory where Steffa was somewhere wandering around the factory. My brother was with our Aunt Eva, as you may recall. She was the doctor. Mother was working on the spooling machine, and suddenly we hear the shouts, "Everybody down into the yard." Mother grabbed me by my hand. She was trying to find a place to hide me, because if the two of us would go down, a woman with a child did not stand a chance, and obviously not the child. She couldn't find a place to hide me. We ran into the office area of the factory, and there was a large file cabinet standing. She opened the drawer of the file cabinet, large empty file cabinet standing in the hallway. She opened the drawer of the file cabinet. She called me to get in and not move, not make any noise until she comes back. She went downstairs into the yard. She ran into Steffa in the yard, and the selection started. The German officer who played God just stood there and said, "Left or right?" He looked at you and said, "Left or right?" No one knew whether right was life or left was life, which side was death. He looked at my mother and he told her to go to the left. My mother looked up and she saw a few doctors that she knew from before the war standing on the right. She started moving to the right. Steffa grabbed her from behind and pulled her to the left. Steffa was able to make those quick decisions, and she had those premonitions like. Steffa was right. Left was the side where you remained alive. In the meantime, I must have fallen asleep lying in this cabinet. And funny enough, I was wearing already then some apartments were empty, and we kids would wander through those apartments looking for toys. I found a wristwatch, which actually was broken, but I was wearing it very proudly. When Mother put me in the drawer of this cabinet, I took my wristwatch and I threw it on the floor, and I said that this is my sacrifice to God if I survive this. I must have fallen asleep, and then I heard voices of Polish policemen coming up. 2 Polish officers came up. They were looking, obviously, for hiding Jews. The cabinet stood against a door into a room, against a closed door of a room. He walked to the cabinet, he saw the watch, I could see them through the crack in the cabinet. He picked up the watch, put it in his pocket, and then he was trying to get to the door, and he started moving the cabinet. The other policeman went around. So I called him and he said, "Hey, how about moving this cabinet and throwing it down on the heads of the Jews below, because the yard was right below. In the meantime, and he was moving the cabinet. In the meantime, the other officer went around and he said, "Don't worry about it, there is another entrance to this room." And they left the cabinet. Mother came up a couple of hours later, and when she saw me alive, she just couldn't believe it. She sort of collapsed on the floor and was crying. And I had to keep on telling her that I was fine and everything was fine. Shortly thereafter, and I keep on going from sort of milestone to milestone, shortly thereafter, there was the big raid on the ghetto. The whole ghetto was emptied. Mother and Stefan knew that if they would take us together with everybody, they went in the direction of the Umschlagplatz. We children wouldn't survive, probably Mother wouldn't survive. No women with children survived in the ghetto, basically. So they decided to hide. We had a good hiding place, which was an attic above an enclosed balcony. Grandma was with us, Stefa's mother, but she had asthma and she refused to come up with us to the attic because she said she would give us away. Next to our building, there was buildings that was destroyed during the war. It was just ruins. And actually you could walk through our apartment into those ruins. So Grandma hid in those ruins. The ghetto became suddenly a ghost town, out of being noisy, busy place. No one was there other than...
So the hiding place in the attic is still in the ghetto.
Yes, it's all in the ghetto.
Do you remember the name of the street?
This was Leshno. It was actually an enclosed balcony where the attic was used by whoever lived there as a sukkah for Sukkot. So it was reasonably comfortable. So basically the ghetto became a ghost town. No sound, no noise. We didn't know what was happening. Obviously people then didn't have radios and couldn't listen to the news. The people in the ghetto just disappeared. We didn't know if the ghetto was being eliminated, whether anybody will come back, what's going to happen. Mother examined how much food we had, and she simply said, once this food is finished, I remember her saying it, we'll go to the roof and hold hands and just fly like the angels do. The first day in the hiding place went without anything happening other than the silence of the place. The next morning we woke up to a woman in our yard singing sad Jewish songs in Yiddish, such as Yiddish Mama. And we wanted to get up and see who it was, and obviously Mother told us to remain quiet and not move. But we could see from our hiding place people from across the street hiding behind chimneys, who came out from behind those chimneys and stood at the edge of the roof and started questioning the woman what was happening.
Okay, we'll have to stop there and we'll continue on the next tape.
Very good. How are we doing?
This is tape number 3. I'm interviewing Mr. Stephen Orlowski. This is April 21, 1995. I'm Mark Goldberg. Okay, please continue the story. You were in the attic with your mother, with your brother, you're hiding. Can you tell me about when this was? Where are we in time?
I would say we're in time late 1942, probably second half of 1942. We are constantly in the ghetto on the grounds of the Carl George Schultz factory or thereabouts, and we are finding different hiding places. So this is one of the hiding places that somebody showed us, which was really excellent. It was very difficult to find. So anyway, on the second day, we woke up. Maybe I'm repeating something there, I don't know. We woke up to this, in total silence, we woke up to this woman in our yard singing the sad Jewish songs in Yiddish. And as I mentioned, we didn't move. We almost did, but we didn't. And people from across the street were hiding behind chimneys, came out and started asking what was happening. Everybody was thirsty to know what has happened. Is this the end of the ghetto? What has happened to all the people? And as we heard their questions, we heard a number of shots, and then the place became totally quiet again. Obviously this was a trap. That afternoon, the Germans and the police came searching our building for people hiding. And actually with the Germans, there was a German Jew, German-Polish Jew, who knew our family, knew mother, knew Stefan. He probably knew that we were hiding. He brought the Germans to our apartment, but they couldn't find where we were. However, they did find Grandma, who was hiding in the ruins of the next door building. And as they took her out of there, as she passed right below our attic, she just very quietly said, "This is the end of it." And then 2 minutes later, we heard a single shot. And Stefa, who was with us, and this was her mother, she was just sitting there, I remember, with her hands, with her arms crossed on her chest. She was wearing short sleeves, and I could see her nails dig so deeply into her arms that she started bleeding, but she had no tears on her face. This was the death of her mother. On the third day, most of the people returned to the factory, and the factory started functioning again. At this point, Mother and Stefa decided that they must send us out of the ghetto into the Polish side of Warsaw. A group of men would leave every morning the factory to go working outside, in Warsaw, outside the ghetto. The policeman accompanying this group was bribed. The policeman in the Warsaw ghetto was bribed. We joined a group of men early in the morning. Obviously we were little children, fairly small children. And a few blocks after we left the ghetto, the policeman told us to leave the group and hide in a staircase of a building. Mela, Aunt Mela, who before she was Stefa's sister, my father's sister, before the war, she married a Polish aviator. She looked Polish. No one ever knew that she was Jewish, and she stayed outside the ghetto. She was supposed to come and pick us up. But before she came, 2 men passed by. They looked at us. And obviously we couldn't carry any packages, so Mother overdressed us. It was a nice warm morning and we were wearing heavy coats. And those men looked at us and they knew that we were Jewish children, I guess just from the way we were dressed. The 2 men were Volksdeutsch. Volksdeutsch were Germans born in Poland, and later they became the 5th column. They approached us and started questioning us. A few minutes later, Mela passed by. She looked at us and she continued walking. I guess even I, who was then, as we were saying, about 9, had enough street smarts not to show any indication that I knew her. Because had we shown any indication, she would have been taken too. After Mela passed, my brother tried to run away. They caught him and they started beating him up. As they caught him, his blue beret, we were wearing blue berets, fell on the ground. I picked it up. Then they took us and told us and put us against a wall facing the street. One of the men took out his handgun. I gave my brother his blue beret and told him to put it on because he'll catch a cold. At this very second, a car passed by, stopped. A German officer in a uniform got out, called the two men and told them not to kill Jews in the middle of the city, but send us to the Umschlagplatz. I guess had this German had another cup of coffee that morning, or was he stuck in the traffic somewhere, our two bodies would have been buried at the foot of that wall. They sent us to the Umschlagplatz, to the ghetto gate. They informed mother, they got out of us obviously who we were. They informed mother in the factory that we were being returned to the ghetto. And I remember approaching the ghetto gate and seeing her petite, fragile figure standing there in the factory coat. Next to her there was sitting a big fat German officer. As soon as we approached them, the German officer searched us. We had some small change in our pockets. And we were smiling because actually we had some gold coins sewn in our underwear, which he didn't find. The German officer ordered the Jewish policeman to take us to the Umschlagplatz. Mother convinced the Jewish policeman to take us to the Jewish police headquarters because she knew a lawyer from before the war who was a fairly senior officer in the Jewish police. The man indeed met us, but he said that he had specific orders to send us to the Umschlagplatz, and there was nothing he could do. At least she had him promised that he'll contact Eva, who worked in the hospital which bordered on the Umschlagplatz, to await our arrival there. The Jewish policeman took us in a rickshaw. A rickshaw was sort of a seat, three across, pushed by a cyclist. Took us in a rickshaw to the Umschlagplatz, and on the way he saw, in the streets of ghetto, he saw a woman walking with two children about our age. He said to mother, "Why don't I let you go and I'll arrest those people in your stead?" Mother told him not to do that. They delivered us to the Umschlagplatz, and luckily, in the gate, Eva was waiting for us. Because as I think I mentioned before, once you got into the Umschlagplatz, once you mingled with the people there, there was no way of finding you or saving you. Eva pulled us immediately into a waiting room of the hospital on the side of the Umschlagplatz. We were told the trains will not be loaded until that evening, so she had few hours to try and get us out of there. She was able to bribe just about everybody who needed to be bribed to pull us back through the hospital into the ghetto. Shortly thereafter, one morning, we woke up and mother was still in bed. She didn't go to work. And we tried to wake her up and she wouldn't wake up. And we called Stefa, and Stefa came. She called the doctor. And mother suffered a stroke. The ambulance came and took her to the hospital. Now apparently it was a mild stroke, and had she received, which she was receiving, the proper physiotherapy, she would have returned reasonably to normal after some time. I actually visited her in the hospital, and I remember a pale face and pulling me towards her and holding me. And this was my last visit in the hospital. Stefa actually had the doctors promise her, so those doctors knew my father, that should the hospital be raided, they'll have mother hide with them in the hiding place. The raid came too fast. Even the doctors didn't manage to hide. All the patients in the hospital were shot in their beds. I can almost visualize this young German soldier standing there and aiming his rifle at mother, and mother saying to him in her perfect German, "You mustn't do that. I have children that," because this is what she always used to say, "I have children that I must take care of." And I can hear the shot ring And I just cannot understand it. Even today, I'm over 60 years old. Why this wonderful woman, who during the long nights in the ghetto, she would read to us Kipling, Jungle Book, Selma Lagerlöf, The Wonderful Journey. She was able to create this magic where we would be outside the ghetto playing with Mowgli in the jungles, or flying with Niels Holgersson on the back of his duck over Sweden. Why this woman who really believed that there is more good in people than evil had to die such a miserable death? I could never understand why we had to grow up without her love, and why she wasn't able to see us grow up. It's just, as I said, being even 60 years old, or more than that, I still haven't gotten over it, and I don't think that one ever does get over his mother being murdered when he was that young. After mother's death, Stefa took charge of us. Many mothers those days in the ghetto abandoned their children because having a child in the ghetto was almost 99% chance of you not surviving. Stefa didn't hesitate, didn't ask any questions. She simply became our second mother. Shortly thereafter, she decided that she must leave the ghetto again. And this time it was differently organized in that a good Polish friend of her who knew a Volksdeutsch had this Volksdeutsch, obviously it was all a lot of money, wait for us outside the ghetto, and he accompanied us one by one to a hiding place. Our hiding place was in an attic. The neighborhood name was Mokotov. I'm not too sure what the street was. The attic belonged to a woman who had a laundry downstairs. The apartment was empty during the day because she worked in the laundry. She was paid a lot of money for keeping us, but in spite of that, she was obviously risking her life. She was very nice to us. She fed us well. She would come in the evenings and sit and talk to us. But I guess during the day, when the apartment was supposed to be empty, we would make a little bit too much noise, and the neighbors complained to the police that there is somebody in the apartment. After being there probably for 2 months, one morning somebody knocked on the door and we froze. And then the individual knocked again and he said, "This is the police, we know you are there, open." We opened the door. Sergeant Zhuk of the Warsaw Polish police came in, interrogated us for about 2 hours. Both of us had perfect stories that we were the relatives of the woman, the laundry woman who came to visit her from a village. Our names was different names. We could recite the Polish prayers any time. I can do it even today. Ojcze nasz, któryś jest w niebiosach, przejdź królestwo Twoje, bądź wola Twoja. I can do all this even today. When he started questioning me, my story became totally confused. I couldn't remember the end of it or the beginning of it, and every time my brother tried to answer for me, the policeman just simply would smack him right across the face. After 2 hours of questioning us, he eventually said to us, "You stay here," and he left. Indeed, when he came to the police station, he confirmed that we were children, relatives of the laundry woman who came to visit her from the village. However, we had to leave the apartment. Incidentally, Aunt Mela sent him a bouquet of flowers to thank him. We had to leave the apartment, and Aunt Mela came and took us to a small village outside Warsaw called Konstancin.
Now, when was this? Let's get the time clear.
Okay. This is probably early 43.
Early
Because
43 that you moved from there to the small village.
Early 43 that we left the ghetto to go to the first hiding place
Right.
in Warsaw.
Mhm.
And actually, I forgot to mention, while we were there, we could already hear the start of the rebellion in the ghetto, because the Poles kept on commenting that they are frying the Jews in the ghetto.
Okay, so the ghetto uprising took place,
Started in
started
43 sometimes.
when you were in your first hiding place.
Right.
So you moved to your second hiding place approximately when?
Sometimes, I would say, must have been April or so, April of 1943.
You know, the uprising was April and May of 43. So
Is
it's
this
in
what,
that,
I'm not too sure. Those are the months.
right. So it's in that period you're in your first hiding place. And do you think you moved during the uprising or after the uprising?
I would say probably during the uprising.
Okay, so maybe it was May of 43. Does that sound right?
Yeah, this sounds right.
Okay, so now you're in the second hiding place in Constantine.
Constantine. We were hidden by a family of farmers that were gatekeepers of some large villa. They put us in a dirt cellar. We have never seen the light of sun. And in spite of all the money that they were getting for hiding us, they barely fed us. And over a period of a month probably, we started developing from malnutrition and probably from the dirt of the place, open sores all over our bodies. You're looking questionable.
No.
Okay. They simply didn't feed us. In the middle of the night, we would leave our cellar and we would try to raid the kitchen, but they would hide all the food. So we never had much luck. At the same time, Stefan and Joseph Frankel left the ghetto as the rebellion started. The whole new book could have been written about their experiences, and I won't get into it. But they could not find a hiding place. They have hidden with some Stefan's friends for a few weeks, and then they had to leave. To hide two adults was very difficult. And obviously the Poles risked their lives, no matter how much money you paid. So they kept on moving every few weeks to another hiding place, and they started running out of hiding places. Also, Stefan started running out of the money, out of those gold coins. At the same time, coincidentally, the German Gestapo in Warsaw declared that, I'm not too sure by what means they declared, that any Jew who had enough money and he was still hiding in Warsaw, if he would come to the Hotel Polania, he could buy foreign papers and would be sent to Switzerland. Actually, I believe there was a book written about the Hotel Polania, this affair. Stefan and Joseph Frankel, not having much else that they could do, they decided to try the Hotel Polania. It could have been a trap. They came there, they spent there 2 days, and they decided that it looked reasonably good. At that point, they told Mela, Stefa's sister, to bring us to the Hotel Polania. When Stefa saw us, she almost fainted. We were skin and bones and covered with open wounds all over our bodies. Actually, she had a doctor immediately attend to us, and he said that probably another 2 weeks we would have contracted blood poisoning and we would not have survived. So in a way, again, this was a lucky turn that we were running out of money. Basically, what the German Gestapo in the Hotel Polania offered was 3,000 visas to South America sent by relatives of people in Poland. Those visas had specific names, specific families, so there would be a visa for 2 grandparents, 2 parents, and 2 children. But those people were no longer alive, so the Gestapo was just selling those visas singularly. So you could have bought a visa as a child, and somebody half your age could have bought a visa as a grandparent. Those visas were quite a bit more expensive. In addition to this, there were 300 Palestinian visas issued, I presume, by the British Mandate government in Palestine to exchange 300 Polish Jews for, I guess, 300 Germans that were held in Palestine. Those visas were the cheaper ones. Joseph Frankel went to the Gestapo office in the hotel, came back to our room, and said to Steffa, "I'm buying 2 visas to South America for you and I, and 2 Palestinian visas, the cheaper ones, for the kids. That's all the money we have." And Steffa told him, and Steffa always believed, the same as mother, that we must never get separated. And she told him, "We're not going to get separated, we're going together. If all that we can afford is 4 Palestinian visas, then you will buy that." Since it was our money, he had to do what she told him. He bought 4 Palestinian visas, and a few days later we were loaded on, mind you, passenger trains and taken to Bergen-Belsen. This was in July of 1943. Initially, Bergen-Belsen, for us the kids, was a paradise. It was a newly constructed camp on the edge of a forest. We were given, since we were supposedly going to be exchanged for or sent to Switzerland, we were given enough basic food such as potatoes and bread. We were able to be in the sun. It was July. The sun was nice and warm. And we started recovering from our souls and being fed what we considered reasonably well. But this didn't last very long. Across the street from us in Bergen-Belsen, a new camp was built for Russian prisoners, which was simply starved to death. We would see Russian prisoners arrive, and a week later, there were just piles of dead bodies. Next to us, there were camps for Jewish people. Same story. And probably in one of those camps there was Anne Frank, because there were Dutch Jews who arrived there. And here again, the people lasted a week or 2, and after that you just saw piles of dead bodies. The stench of death was all around us. The procession of wagons drawn by people full of dead bodies kept on passing right in front of our camp day and night. Bergen-Belsen was turning slowly to what it has become known. Our food was totally diminished. We had 2 pieces of bread and some kind of a bowl of watery soup a day. And then one Wednesday, the Gestapo arrived in our camp and they started the selection. And this continued for about 8 or 10 Wednesdays. And every time they selected 300 or 400 people, holders of the South American visas. We didn't know if they were going to Switzerland or they were going to the death. Eventually we learned that the Gestapo in Berlin realized that all those South American visas, or the people that had them, were fake, and they ordered their extermination. So eventually, out of 3,300 people, the camp was diminished to 300 people, holders of the Palestinian visas. Our luck was that the Germans simply left us alone. We would have a roll call in the morning, roll call in the evening, which could be for 2 hours in snow, whatever. But other than this, they didn't bother us. They barely fed us. People died of starvation, but of nothing else. Normally children, such as Anne Frank, didn't last in Bergen-Belsen more than a few days. And we were in Bergen-Belsen for close to 22 months. Towards the end of being in Bergen-Belsen, I would just spend most of the time in bed. I was too weak to get up, and I was sort of slowly disappearing. Probably another few months and I would have been just dead from malnutrition. Now, we were designated for exchange for Palestine. On April the 7th, we were loaded on a train. Actually, we had to walk to the train for about 5 miles, which I couldn't do, so Stefan Frankel carried me. We were loaded on the train, and the German officer in charge of the train was told that he was given a destination, which we didn't know what it was, but he was told that if he cannot bring us to the destination, he must finish us off if he gets stuck at the point where the front is there. The train went on and off for 5 days, stop and go. Eventually we arrived in a clearing in a forest not too far from Magdeburg. The Germans lined us up along the train. They had 4 machine guns, and as we were standing there, suddenly, out of the trees beyond the clearing, we saw olive green tanks with white stars. And then behind it, the American infantry. This was the US 9th Army. This was April 13, one day after Roosevelt died. And this was liberation. I remember a big black soldier came first, and Stefan grabbed him and gave him a big kiss. And obviously the men among the prisoners attacked the German soldiers, which the Americans had to save from being beaten up, the least to say. So on April 13 we were liberated.
What condition were you and your brother Stefa and her boyfriend in at that time?
Well, they were basically in skeletal condition, so to speak. My brother, the minute we were liberated, he went back into the train compartment. We had a suitcase there with our food reserve, which were 2 loaves of bread and some jam. And he ate the 2 loaves of bread and jam, and he was sick for the next week. I was too weak to move or do much. It was basically, we were sort of just running out of life, most of us.
Okay, now, did you assume your father was dead all this time?
We really didn't know where he was, and we didn't think too much about it. We presumed that he was dead, since we never heard from him after he was sent to Siberia.
Okay. We'll stop now and we'll continue on the next tape.
So we did exactly
Today is April 21, 1995. This is tape number 4. I'm interviewing Mr. Stephen Orlowski. I am Mark Goldberg. We're in Port Washington. Okay, the train arrived to the central clearing, the clearing next to the forest near Magdeburg. You've just been liberated. Please continue the story from there and take us forward to this day.
The American Army sent us, I guess, I'm not too sure that it was on a train or trucks. They sent us to Hillesleben, and I think I have the spelling of that. It was a displaced persons camp. Actually, Hillesleben during the war was built as a small town for German officers. It was a very modern kind of facility. We were assigned an apartment in Hillesleben. In the meantime, Joseph Frankel, still on the train, attracted typhoid and he died. He was taken in Hillesleben to the morgue. And actually my brother, who I didn't mention, but in Bergen-Belsen towards the end, we had to share single bunks. Two people had to share one bunk, which was really single, like about 3 feet wide. My brother had to sleep with Joseph Frankel and I slept with Stefan. And they would kick each other the whole night. They just hated each other. So when Joseph Frankel died, my brother wasn't terribly sorry. They took him to the morgue, and then an American nurse walked into the morgue and she saw something moving. And it was Joseph Frankel. So they retrieved him and he recovered. My aunt Steffa also contracted typhoid, but it wasn't as bad a case and she survived. This was all in Hillesleben. We were assigned a small apartment, which was a German officer's apartment, which was loaded with furniture, which must have been some kind of probably from a Jewish family, because those were expensive, heavy ebony furniture. And Steffa, I don't know from where, got 2 axes. And he told us the apartment was too small for us and the furniture, and she told us just to axe those furniture and throw them out of the window. And we started doing this with great zeal. There were still some German residents in that area, and they started screaming to us, barbarians. So Steffa stuck her head out of the window and she told them that their soldiers threw our children out of the windows, and if they are not going to disappear, she'll call the police. So the Germans disappeared. It was just sort of an accident that I remember, because we had so much fun chopping those furniture. We were in Hillesleben for about 2.5 months, because probably sometimes in June of 1945, Germany was divided. It was agreed that this part of Germany will become Eastern Germany under the Russian influence, and the Russian troops started moving in that area. I don't know how, but the Jewish emigres in Hillesleben either rented a train, leased a train, or bribed the train driver, and we all got on the train and started moving west. And eventually we ended up just escaping from the Russian army as it advanced. No one wanted to be caught in the Russian territory. We ended up in Belgium. In Belgium, for the first week or so, we spent running from one assistant agency to another, looking for some help. Financial help, apartment, clothes. And at that time, I think Steffa was sort of running out of steam looking after us. She was good at fighting for our lives, all of our lives. But suddenly, we were children in something that started being peace. She wanted to see us go to school. She wanted to see us settled. She had no financial means. She had no place to live. She was just a displaced person, and she wanted for us to no longer be displaced children. We ended up in a castle not too far from Brussels. The castle was sort of a camp for displaced children. In one of the agencies, she met a Belgian woman who took to Steffa. The Belgian woman was a wife of a blue blood, some kind of a count or something, Belgian. They lived in a castle not too far from Brussels. They were childless. They met Steffa a number of times, they met us. And then the man offered that they adopt us, my brother and I. We will go to the school where he was raised, private school. Obviously, Steffa would have full access to us, but we would become his children. Just shows you how crazy things can go after a war, during a war. We would suddenly turn into, I presume, Christian Belgian children. At the same time, Stefan was approached by Palestinian people, Jews from Palestine, and they told us that Palestine needs young children. They offered Stefan immediately 2 visas to Palestine, and they promised her additional 2 visas within a couple of months. Stefan decided to send us to Palestine. My brother actually was quite, this was in Belgium, my brother was actually quite happy to get away from Joseph Frankel and to get Stefan off his back. For me, it was losing my mother for the second time. I remember the American trucks came to take us to Marseille from where we were supposed to send to Palestine. And I just held on to Stefan and screamed my head off, didn't stop crying. But obviously it didn't help because we were separated. So what the Germans, over the war period, didn't succeed in separating us, I guess at that point the situation did separate us. We arrived in Marseille, we spent in Marseille a few weeks. And then we boarded a boat by the name of Matrua, who arrived in September in Atlit. Now Atlit was a great place for us because there was lots of food and no one bothered us.
Where exactly is Atlit?
Atlit is not too far from Haifa. This
In
was
Israel.
In Israel, then Palestine. And I think we have a picture showing as we get off the train on the way to Atlit. It was basically controlled by the British. This was the only way to enter Palestine legally. Obviously there are many people who went illegally. And after a couple of weeks in Atlit, there was a whole group of children. We were approached by representatives of the Jewish settlement who represented different political parties, which were, I don't know, 20, 30, 40. And they simply started asking us which party we belonged to, because I guess at that point many children who had Zionist background knew what movement they belonged to. So when they came to us, they asked us, what party do you belong to? So we said, what parties do you have? And they mentioned a few names, and they said, among others, Gordonia, the party of Gordon. We as children read the famous Polish author Sienkiewicz, who, among others, wrote Quo Vadis. He wrote a book about 2 children escaping from Khartoum, where General Gordon defended Khartoum during the rebellion. So he said, if this is General Gordon's party, then it must be a good party. So we joined Gordonia. Was very lucky again, because we were sent to a kibbutz Ganigar, which was a small kibbutz, a kvutza, where people accepted us with open arms, treated us the same as the kibbutz children. Not all youth aliyah were treated the same as the kibbutz children. In most places they were not. We grew up together with the kibbutz children, and we were adopted by a family. And we just had a good childhood there. Just backtracking a little bit, in 1946, my father survived being a doctor in Siberia, working in hospitals, not exposed to the severe weather. And when Poland became part of the Eastern Bloc, the Polish prisoners were repatriated back to Poland. He wrote to us a few letters, and obviously we knew then that he was alive. I wrote to him long letters asking him to come to Palestine so we can be together. But by the time he made up his mind to join us in Palestine, the Polish Iron Curtain closed and there was no way of getting out. So we stayed in Poland. In 1952 I graduated from high school in Ganigar and I joined the Israeli Armed Forces. I was in the army for 4 years. I was in the infantry and the paratroopers. And I got out of the army as a captain. Just before I was released by the army, my brother called me one day in the camp and he said, "Are you sitting?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Our father is in Israel." The following day we met him. He was smuggled. Apparently Israel had a way of getting people out of the Eastern Bloc, bringing them to Israel, but no one knew how, and father never told us how. However, at that point, my brother was an adult, I was an adult. Our father remarried in Israel. He continued practicing medicine, but really never very warm relationships existed between us. It was simply, I guess, too late. In 1957, after the first Suez campaign, I should mention that in the meantime, Stefan Joseph Frankel found his second daughter in South Africa. She got papers for them to go to Johannesburg, and they emigrated to Johannesburg from Belgium. He was a good businessman, and he did very well financially. In 1957, Stefa kept on writing to me, asking me to come. She sent me the papers, and since I wanted to finish my university education, I went to Johannesburg. I lived in Johannesburg for 4 years. Unfortunately, I came on a visitor's visa, so with the South African government being totally anti-Semitic, they were not willing to exchange my visitor's visa to a student visa. And I ended up going to work in Rhodesia for 4 years, where a Johannesburg conglomerate asked me to run the businesses in Rhodesia. I met Netta, my wife, in the Israeli army. She was a sergeant and I was an officer. This was the only time that I could tell her what to do. And I'm not sure of that either. And when I left for South Africa, she followed shortly thereafter, and we were married in Johannesburg. And my wife's family settled in the United States, and in 1962 we came to the United States. And we have been here since. My brother has changed his name to Uri Orlev, and he lives in Jerusalem. He's a reasonably well-known writer in Israel. I guess that's about it. I'm sure I left a few things here and there.
Well, I want to go back and ask you one question, and then I want you to continue this story because I'd like to know what profession you were in and tell me about your children. But just for a minute or two, go back to liberation. What did they do for you in Hillesleben? How did you get well? You were in such terrible condition. Were you treated by physicians? Was it just a matter of rest? What happened to you in Hillesleben?
We were treated by physicians, slow feeding. Being children, I guess you bounce back fairly quickly. And eventually we sort of got back to normal within a few months. Hillesleben was a good transition period. We were well treated, well fed, given all the amenities. Well, to us it looked like all the amenities.
So by the time you got to Brussels, you were two reasonably healthy boys.
Reasonably healthy, as you might see from one of the pictures there, which was taken in Brussels. We were reasonably healthy. We were probably smaller in size than most children our age, because simply our development was arrested for like 4 or 5 years.
Right.
But other than this, my brother, over the years, he suffered a lot of mental problems. I think because I was younger, I think I got out of it, if anybody's normal, reasonably normal. I mean, basically all those stories are reasonably abbreviated on any one period of our lives. You could probably write a book, but
Right.
just to give you a feel.
Just briefly, take me from 57 to today, from 62 rather, when you arrived in the United States, to today. What sort of work did you do? Tell me about your children.
Trying to go in the footsteps of my father, like all, I guess, good Jewish boy, I decided to go for medicine. I studied for medicine for a couple of years, but I wasn't, well, then at least it looked to me like I wasn't that young anymore, because I was 29. And at the same time, I got a job with one of the companies of the Continental Insurance Group. And I started doing very well there. Within a short period of time, I was made manager of a department. And so I switched from biology and chemistry to business and accounting. I did it at night. Over an eight-year period, I finished my studies at night. But by that time, I was the vice president of the company. I worked for this company for 31 years, with the last 10 years or so. Well, the company has a president, and under the president there was an executive vice president who was me. The president took care of the marketing of we were a financial company. He took care of the marketing of the product. I took care of the running of the company, of the financial side. Basically my title was Chief Financial Officer and Chief Administrative Officer. So it was the president, myself, and then there was a group of senior vice presidents. I was very proud of myself because, at least in the initial years, I was the only Jew who made it that high within the company. And after 31 years, being under the pressure of the Wall Street financial markets and whatever else, I decided at the age of 60 that there is more to life than getting up 5 o'clock in the morning and coming home 7, 8 o'clock. And here I am.
Hey, tell me about your children.
Now, in 1964, Michelle was born here in New York, actually in Brooklyn. We came to the United States on my quota, which was the Polish quota, which was then not filled in. But my wife is a registered nurse, so she had a job. So we sort of came because she had a job and on my quota. In the hospital she was admitted to was Brookdale in Brooklyn, so we found an apartment not too far from the hospital. Michelle, our first daughter, was born in 1964 in Brooklyn. She's today 31 years old. She has become a very bright girl. She has become a CPA. Then she didn't like doing accounting, and she switched to marketing, and today she's a director of marketing at Time Warner. She married an exceptionally young man. His name is Scott Weber. He's a gastroenterologist who is today involved in liver transplants with the New York University. Our son, who was born in 1969, his name is Neil David. He graduated from Binghamton with English and cinematography, and he's trying to get into the movie-making business. This is where he is today. That's why I was asking Steve here whether he needs any assistance.
Only unpaid.
Well, he did quite a bit of it, quite a bit of the unpaid work. Now he's looking, I'm looking for him to get paid work.
Yes. Okay, we'll continue in a few moments with your wife and then with the documents. Thank you for the story.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for being here. I mean, it's a terrific job that you guys do.
Okay, Mr. Orlowski, please introduce your wife to us.
Okay, this is Netta, my wife. We were married in 1959 in Johannesburg, and we lived in Rhodesia, and then we came to the United States where Netta's family lived. And I guess I'll leave it up to you to tell what you did in the United States and whatever you want.
Okay, please tell us whatever you'd like.
We met in the Israeli army. He was my officer. I was a sergeant. We had a short courtship. He, after a year and a half, he moved to South Africa. I was still in nursing school. I followed him a year after I graduated. We lived in South Africa for 2.5, 3 years. And then we moved to the States. He's a wonderful fellow. I think the fact that his history makes him want and makes a special effort to build a relationship, to create a family. Trying to, I think, subconsciously maybe, he was trying to replace the family that he lost. So we never had fights that went unresolved. There was always a determination to make it work, to make our family a unit and survive. And I guess that's all.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, please introduce us to your daughter and your son-in-law.
Okay, this is Michelle that we mentioned before. Michelle is now a marketing director at Time Warner. Her husband, Scott Weber, is a gastroenterologist who works at New York University, and I think his most favorite part of his job is liver transplants.
How old are you?
Yeah, sorry. Michelle is 31 and he's 33.
Okay, thank you.
This is Neil, our son, 25 years old. This is actually a picture from Michelle's wedding 2 years ago. And he's now into movie making and television work, and that's about it.
Okay, Mr. Orlowski, this is the oldest picture you have of members of your family from before the war.
That's right.
Before you comment on this picture, I'd like to ask you one last question. This picture probably goes back 70 or so years. In the years from the time this picture was taken through 1945, 46, some members of your family did not survive. You and your brother, who stayed together, went through some very, very difficult times that you just described. When you look back on this from your vantage point today, you're married, you have 2 children, one of whom is married, you live in this lovely home, you collect antiques, you're retired from a successful career. What do you make of all this?
Well, I guess what I make of all this, I find it a little bit difficult to transport myself from where I'm here today to this picture, which is probably, as you say, 70 or 80 years ago. There's such a vast time and occurrences difference that's difficult to compare, but yet those are the basis for my being alive here today. Those are the people that made it possible. Maybe I should just simply mention who those people are, which ties into the story that we just turned over. Would this be okay?
Yes.
From the left to the right. Do you have this little... Going from the left to the right, this is actually my mother's family. Those are all her brothers and sisters, 7 of them. Going from the left to the right, the first is Uncle Edek, whom I mentioned in our story in the ghetto. Unfortunately, something I didn't mention, at some point he was caught in the middle of a ghetto street in a raid, and there was no way that he could have gotten out of it. He always carried with him a poison pill, and we think that he probably committed suicide before he was taken to a death camp. He was an engineer before the war, and also he was an active member of the Communist Party, which was then very fashionable with the young Jewish intelligentsia. Standing next to him to the left is my mother, who at that point was a high school student. Next to her is her younger brother, who is one of the sons of my grandfather who worked for him, lived in Częstochow, and was taken that morning that again I described in my story. Standing is probably what they used to consider the prettiest and oldest sister. She married a very wealthy attorney in London, and during the war, and I don't know all the reasons, she committed a suicide. Sitting up front is another of my mother's brothers. He was the youngest. He also worked for my grandfather and was lost that morning when the Germans came to my grandfather's house. The man standing to, or the boy standing to his left is the third brother who was also taken by the Germans. The girl sitting is my Aunt Eva, who became a doctor and saved our lives numerous times. And she always had a dog. She's sitting there with her dog. You can see already in this picture that she was a pretty girl. Incidentally, my Aunt Eva, which I didn't mention before, survived the war, hiding in Warsaw. Eventually she joined the Russian army, entered Warsaw, and she died in Warsaw. Her daughter still lives in Warsaw.